All right, so here we are, Breaking Dad episode. Well, this is a new one to get both of you guys, so I'm getting Dad up and down, which is kind of cool, and this might wind up being rare in the future to get both of y'all in a quiet house. So, um, y'all can go anywhere you want, but one thing I want you to explain to Papa that I think all of us in the family are struggling with getting our head around is that foundationally right now on the way to figuring out artificial intelligence, it seems like most of what you're doing is trying to better understand how the brain works, how we think, how all that process happens. And you're doing some pretty interesting work just trying how we're understanding that. And like some of the things you've enlightened me about like the brain doesn't work in intuitive ways, the ways that we thought. And so I think that Papa would love to hear some of that. And I know you don't know some of this stuff, so you're going to love this.
Yeah.
And so if we don't cover anything else today, if you can get into some of that and cover off some of that, where you're at right now at this point in time, which is just we know it's a waypoint to some other things, and that's okay. Is that cool?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome.
So I think for a long time, it's been a popular notion in science fiction to wonder, is it possible to build into machines or to create some artificial kind of intelligence, right? Is it possible to mimic the kinds of behaviors and complex cognitive processes that we know are capable, that we know are possible in our universe because, our brains are proof of concept? Is there a way that we can duplicate them or even make them better, similar to how we, looked at how birds had wings and used them for like aerodynamic lift, and then built airplanes that and now exceed the velocity of even the fastest birds. So to get there, there's been about 100 years of thinking on this and modeling and creating small computer programs. It's only been recently that like with the advent of GPUs and large-scale computing and like larger memory, that you can train these models and actually rival human performance on like vision tasks, on language tasks and other things. So it seems like it's so great. So we can now take basically a big model of a brain, train its parameters, like train the connections between neurons, and through this optimization procedure, minimize the statistical loss, which is basically I try to take in an image, I try to predict what it's a picture of. I have the actual ground truth label that someone on Amazon Mechanical Turk like labeled it as, and then I use that error to sort of back propagate and figure out like how to adjust the parameters in the model to get better fit. There are a lot of problems that remain here. I think it is a remarkable amount of progress, but some fundamental things may be limiting the progress of this approach going forward. I work on this mainly, and I think that it's very promising, but there are some open problems. So we can get into the open problems if you guys want. I don't know if that was too technical. I could also give a bit of some examples recently of where I think ideas from studying actually how the brain processes information might be useful in actually developing better artificial intelligence.
That'd be good to hear.
So like one thing on the surface, it looks like we're making progress in AI, right? We've had our phones, Alexa can listen to us, and our phones are kind of, you say, hey, I want directions to the Walmart or whatever, and it pretty reliably figures out what you said. Our Google photo recognition seems to be kind of working. There's a lot of, and then just look at GP3 recently and the progress there. That's kind of scary, right? Because some of that stuff is looking, is starting to really look, not general AI yet, but really, really solid, kind of narrow, specific AI. And so, like, to any casual observer, I think it looks like we're making vast leaps in progress here. But after spending a year with you, my impression is that we're actually more stuck than most people know. Do you think that that's fair?
I need to qualify the statement. I think we are kind of stuck. I think there need to be new ideas. But first, I will say significant progress has been made. Right? If your metric is just performance on learning tasks, we have made incredible progress since like 2014, 2015, with the big ImageNet breakthroughs. And you could look at any domain, like image segmentation, automatic speech recognition, natural language processing, any of these big fields. There's been incredible improvements on the metrics of interest, and now you have like, and we figured out basically how to get these large models to work, how to train them effectively, how to utilize parallel computation to get them to train. But there are problems, right? So I think one big problem, let's say in the case of natural language processing, and I mean I'm not the only, like, I think there are a lot of good arguments made by people like Noam Chomsky and Josh Tenenbaum and others that have pointed out that these models, they are trained basically in a statistical manner, right, to predict, you know, the next few words in a sentence based on like the past few words or the past few sentences. However, they don't possess like any kind of common sense idea of what symbols they're manipulating. There's just basically a bunch of vectors that go into the thing and then vectors that come out. And as a consequence, sometimes you get strings of words that come out of the algorithm that don't actually adhere to any sort of semantic meaning. Like they've learned basically the syntax and the correlations in language, like what words co-occur with other words, but they haven't actually. There's no mental model of like something that's happening out in the world and a test for whether that's plausible.
It's like there's a statistical probability that the next word I'm going to say is blah. Right.
Based on all the other words.
Versus I have this contextual understanding, this real understanding of what is happening. And who knows, is our brain really just running a statistical engine, or is there actually something more sophisticated?
Yeah, you have to be humble about these things. I mean, I don't know. I think that it could be argued that early in development, a young child is basically looking for statistical correlations and word co-occurrences, and it's trying to figure this out. Other people think though that there's fundamental, like what makes language powerful is the idea of it's the actual concept level. It's not at the level of like symbols and symbols co-occurrence. It's actually about like being able to recursively define more and more complex operations, like who did what to whom, where, like why, you know, I know that you know that I know that you know that I know that you know. Like these complicated recursive, like you can go to arbitrary depth kinds of things. That's what actually lets you have general intelligence. So some people think that that's true. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case, but
so here's my I was talking earlier about my definition, if you will, of art. And so we have an artist, could be somebody who paints, somebody who writes text, someone who's sculpts. There's all kind of art, and we as observers of that art look at it, and what my definition of art is incomplete communication. And you're describing essentially incomplete communication of these associated words, but it's not a complete understanding of it. And what you have to bring for it to be art is something of yourself to that statue or painting or text. You have to bring something to complete that communication.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're saying is missing at this point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's the lack of the world model, the lack of an internal.
So AI is not picture. Art at this point.
Right. So it's have you heard of the Chinese room thought experiment? Are you guys familiar with this?
I don't think you've ever told me this either.
Okay, so this philosopher John Searle in like the 1970s had this idea of imagine you have a man in a room and he has a big instruction book, right? And what he does is people shuffle in these Chinese characters, and they're basically like questions. And then he has a big book, and he can go look inside the book and figure out, okay, for this collection of Chinese characters, what collection of Chinese characters do I output? He doesn't speak any Chinese, okay? But the book is sufficiently complicated enough so that it can actually produce responses that are pretty accurate. Okay, so the question is like, does this, where is the knowledge of Chinese, the Chinese language? Is it in the book? Is it in the book plus the guy who's manipulating the symbols? Is it in the, so is this collective entity, whatever this thing that, I shuffle in the Chinese symbols and then I get something out that looks reasonable? Where is that reasonable coming from?
Was it a room full of of a million monkeys banging away for 1 billion years, or is it actually something?
Well, someone put that book together, and that was an incredible step to anticipate that someone was going to have these characters, and there's thousands of Chinese characters, and have them in some order. So there was an anticipation of that, and that's art of a sort. And then this person is really just a mechanic
Right.
who is transitioning from, think of it almost as a black box. He's got these input characters. It goes through the book and comes out as output characters. He's just a black box. And then on the output, there has to be someone who completes that communication and understands what was being asked, what was said. So that's my vision of.
But is there an understanding, for instance, of the sentence that went in? Is there an
by the end person, not by the black box person?
Well, so the user, right? The user that queries, that passes in Chinese characters and then gets a response. He probably knows what he's thinking. But I'm saying, was anything in the room understanding that input sequence, that query, that initial query of Chinese?
Only as much as it was captured in the book by the person who wrote the book, not by the person who's looking up those characters.
So I agree with that, and I think the problem is that the modern language models, you can make the analogy that the corpus of text on the internet is the book.
Okay.
And the AI agent is like the guy shuffling the symbols around.
Okay.
Right? And so he doesn't really have an appreciation of what is being said, but he has a large enough statistical corpus to figure out when certain characters co-occur with other characters.
So while we're on the topic of incomplete information, do you remember? I can't remember if this was a decade ago or multi-decades or maybe just a few years. You at one point along the way gave me a really great layman's explanation of a Fourier transform. Do you remember this?
Wow, I haven't thought about Fourier. It was sometime in San Antonio.
Yeah, I mean, this could have been
20 years ago.
This could have been 20 years ago. Do you have any? You've got a hell of a memory. I'm curious if you have any recollection of how you. I think your brain had actually developed a pretty good like layman's model of what's actually happening in a Fourier transform. Do you remember this?
I do not remember it, and I do not recall what I told you. I mean, I know generally. I still remember generally what a Fourier transform.
All right. So what's your understanding of it?
Wow.
In the context of limited information.
This is a test.
No. I'm just you had blessed me with this actually, and it's funny that because it really helped me, and actually like when I was an engineer, and I think you had just gone through all
this
that.
This may have just come out shortly after AFIT.
Right.
When I just finished my master's, which would have been in the 80s.
Yeah.
So now that's 40 years ago, and I'm telling you, there's just not very much of it that I remember. I know what little corner of the world that fits in, but I don't have
so the way you would explain it to me back then, and Blake can take this way beyond this, but there's this kind of domain of mathematics that is all about filling in the gaps with limited information, and and it's like when you're looking through the screen of a screen porch, right? And you're looking through that, and even though the screen is blocking half of the information, you still see this beautiful backyard with tree, and you can make out the trees and the chairs and the flowers and all of that, even in an environment.
And I recall now that it was about. I studied it for communication purposes because so many bits in communication get dropped and get lost. And how do you fill those in?
Right. What I perceive is a lot of what you're doing is in that domain of trying to figure out how are we mathematically removing noise or removing, things that are blocking information or filtering that out and finding the signal and all of that. I don't know, maybe you can unpack some of that as well.
Yeah, so actually concurrent with the original development of information theory by Claude Shannon in the 1950s, was actually an immediate application area, which is thinking of the brain as a kind of signal processing device, right? And which is like fairly, if you imagine you're detecting the profile of this wave as an auditory signal in your auditory cortex. you're also, processing all the sort of light stimulation onto your photoreceptor.
Right.
Getting
the
rid
surrounding
of
around the sound.
like getting rid of noise, extracting useful features, and then like being able to recognize objects. Okay, so how do you go from
Turning your head so you maximize the input into your auditory receivers.
And what's interesting is just going from like photoreceptor cells to like retinal ganglion cells. We know that there's you can measure just in like information theoretic terms, like how many bits go in, how many bits are present after you do that first step of processing, and it's about a 100 to 1,000 fold dimension reduction. So the number of bits shrinks dramatically. So you had way more information potentially, but you got rid of a lot of the stuff you didn't need, right? Because it turns out for evolutionary purposes, you don't care about some of the higher frequency content and the light, or the shot noise.
What I've studied about evolution is that men and women are different in those domains. That men really want to reduce the amount of information so they can get it down to the real minimal things that are going to kill them, the saber-toothed tiger kind of thing. Whereas women really want more information so they can see where to gather the food. And so I don't know if you've seen a difference in men and women, but I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, I know in higher level areas like that could be true, but we're still very struggling to get a handle on even these early sensory processing. But so I think there's actually very little genetic gender-wise, variation in terms of visual processing, for instance. So like, I think that example is, everyone's retinal ganglion cells kind of work the same.
So
and ours actually aren't that different than
it's all in the head.
Other organisms.
It's how the processing of that.
Right. So there's so let's talk about the brain, I guess. So there's the exciting or interest. So there's the old part of the brain that took a long time to develop, and this has areas known as like nucleus accumbens, the striatum, like these other things. These are involved in reward signaling. So like you're hungry and then you eat something, you feel a sense of like reward. That dopaminergic signal comes from that old part of the brain, and like other animals from way back in our evolutionary history that we share common ancestors with a long time ago also have those same sort of circuits. But then more recently, there's been the development of this the cortex. This is the outer sheet of the brain, and there's like parts of the cortex that are devoted to sensory processing, so like visual information processing, like the visual cortex and the visual ventral stream. And then there's also like the audio cortex. There's but then the part that I think we associate with top-down reasoning, personality, all these other things. It's the prefrontal cortex. So that's the very last kind of thing that was developed, and that's what sort of lets us. I mean, we know that it's involved in attention. We know that it's involved in like being able to regulate your behavior, and so that's sort of the part of yourself that's like I don't know. Freud's silly, but like Freud would call it like the ego or whatever. It's the regulatory part of your brain.
That's where the id exists.
No, so the id would be like the deep part of your brain, right? Like that's the id would be like the pleasure-seeking kind of hedonist in your brain, but the guy who's regulating your behavior is like the prefrontal cortex. So we know there's this guy Phineas Gage, and he worked on the railroad, and one day like a railroad spike actually shot up and went through part of his prefrontal cortex, and he survived, miraculously. I don't know how, but he's an interesting case study because his personality completely changed. He became an unruly drunk. He got in fights all the time, and he was like unable to sort of do a lot of the regulatory behavior regulation that we associate with like civilized life, or like what separates humans from animals, I guess. So
and we went through the prefrontal cortex.
Yeah. It's this area of the brain.
Yeah, that's a fascinating. There's some great YouTube videos on that online. Yeah, you should check that out sometime. It's pretty fascinating. This guy. I mean, I can't believe he lived, because we assume like you have that kind of blunt force damage to the brain and you're just gonna die. But we give people lobotomies and split their brains in half, and they go on to live like normal lives. It's pretty wild, like how. One of the things I'm learning from you too is a level of plasticity in the brain, and how my sensing is that the brain is this just extremely general purpose mass that is constantly rewiring and morphing around. Morphing in new ways, and there's very little specialization in our brain. There is some, obviously whatever the thing is that's making your heart beat or making you breathe, those are kind of hardwired, and we're not rewiring those things, right? But the vast majority of like your cortex is constantly in flux, and it's kind of like when you're training a neural network, we're constantly retraining and changing the weights of the synapses and
It's
all
just a
that.
big mess. It's an all connectoplasm mess. There's no.
It's pretty fascinating, the level of plasticity.
Yeah, I think it's still an open question. We don't really understand it that well. We know that, for instance, there are areas that are dedicated to certain things, but even recent experiments show that it's a little bit more of this soup, this sort of information soup that you're talking about. For instance, there's this experiment recently that showed that a lot of the variance in responses in like the visual part of your brain is dependent upon what behavior you're doing. So if you're a mouse running on the treadmill or versus a mouse standing still, and you're looking at the same image, you could have completely different kind of neural response profiles in your V1. So it's like why is the visual part of my brain now so dependent on my motion or whatever.
But it's probably an important thing to just apply to life hacks or something. Like if you're stuck on a problem or something, then that's why like sometimes going for a walk or something can kind of, or just doing something out of whatever that context that you're in can jar.
But it makes it hard for, I think, conventional notions of neuroscience research where you think like, oh, I'm going to find that neuron or that collection of neurons that does this particular thing, and this is going to be that module. I'm going to separate it.
We'll flip that bit.
And then there's going to be this other module that does memory, and there's this other module that does language processing.
There's a blind piano player, and they've studied him, and they have done the checking blood sugar in his brain, and he is using his visual cortex to support his music because he's a virtuoso, he's a genius, he's a Beethoven kind of level genius player, can hear something, instantly play it, and then take 4 different things and put them all together, and so he needs a whole lot more processing than just auditory, and they've found that he's using his visual cortex because it's not any use to his eyes, and so it's completely been rewired.
Is that Matthew Whitaker, by any chance? African American?
He is African American.
It might be this Matthew Whitaker. Cool, I'm gonna go check that out.
He's
I think I might have watched that with you a couple years ago.
Oh,
yeah.
well, I just recently saw it again within the last 6 weeks.
Yeah,
Okay.
that idea that you could rededicate an entire
that's been around a while.
The idea that you could rededicate an entire region of the cortex.
Which goes to your dad's point, is that there's a lot
generalized
of
plasticity.
and it may not be 100%. It may just be like the
cortex,
the outer stuff.
Yeah, I mean this goes back to the
new
nature
stuff.
the nature nurture. So you could try quantifying suppose I were to have a hardwired set of rules about what part of the brain or what neurons code for which things. Is there enough information in my genome to actually specify that development? And it doesn't look promising, right? Because there's 100 trillion synapses that you'd have to specify beforehand.
Wow.
It's easier to just learn those from experience, I think. So there is some element of sort of a genomic bottleneck where you have basically as much information about the crucial parts of brain development that are specified by your genes, but then a large portion of what makes you you is the actual learning and development, your interaction with the environment.
Right. I mean, language, everyone has most humans have this ability to learn a language. But look at all the different languages. So there's not like a specific language gene. There's more of a ability to learn a language gene.
What was the book like a couple of years ago that was talking about like literally the language that you learn has like just the language alone, independent of any other environmental impacts, foundationally changes like your cultural mindset.
Because you think in that language.
You know what I'm talking about? Like Chinese, like there's a lot of things that they think about, like the past and the future. That's different than how a lot of English speakers, because they don't have the same kind of I don't know, words for these tenses.
I've recently seen something that suggests that the Chinese have a more communal view of their lives and their environment than we do. We have a more individualistic view coming out of our experience from Europe, but the Chinese have this more communal, and I don't think it's a surprise that their government is a communist government and that ours is a, whatever you want to call it, government, but much more individualistic individual freedoms, individual rights, and they're more communal because that's their words. That's the words that they learn, which is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to. I think it's hard to disentangle culture and language because you could imagine also culture having an effect on dialects and like the kinds of words
Vice
you need to.
versa,
Yeah.
yeah.
So it's sort of a cycle probably. But what you do hear things like for instance in the West, like what do you guys think of when you think of the future? You think you're looking out to the future, right? Like it's something out in front of you, right? Like there was the past back there and now there's the future. But apparently in China, the past is back there because you can see it. Right? Like so when people talk about the past or the
It's in
future,
front of
they'll
you.
say like oh next week or next month and they'll point backwards. Because
Which feels totally opposite.
So like you know
You can't see that.
time is flowing like this way for in that sort of Eastern.
It's visual. It's visible this way.
But I think that makes more sense. Like you can see the past, right? Like I
It's
have
visible
memory
this
of
way.
the
It's
past.
not visible.
I don't
that
know
way.
what's behind. I don't know what's coming up, right?
That's
But you know,
interesting.
we have this whole idea, I guess. I don't know, but maybe you're hiking. Or something. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm going there, right? It's more of a different. It's a different,
Right.
slightly different view. But yeah, I don't know how much of this is due to language. So there's a linguist in like the I guess the 1960s ish. This guy Benjamin Whorf and also his student Sapir. So there's this hypothesis called in linguistics called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is like that language kind of determines or limits the scope of your concepts that you can have. So like the language that you inherit actually makes it impossible for you to have certain thoughts, or it makes it, or yeah, it can basically limit the scope or of the kinds of thoughts you can think, right? And so that makes if you believe something like that, then the George Orwell like language policing ideas make sense, right? But it turns out so in his book The Language Instinct, Steven Pinker I think has he has a lot of empirical arguments that he mounts, sort of suggesting that the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is not true. It seems that all natural languages that we've encountered, actually are in some sense, concept complete. You can express any concept that you could express in one language, you can express in another. You might need more words or
Is
something.
this in Better Angels?
No, this is The Language Instinct. This is like work that he's sort of known for, and so he was first like a kind of cognitive scientist and linguist, and this was kind of his early focus.
So are he and Noam Chomsky kind of like?
Yeah, they swim in the same waters, I guess. Yeah,
Interesting.
Harvard, MIT, kind of.
Yeah.
But
So if if you have a broad vocabulary, then you have more words to describe more different things. With a limited book, and I'm seeing this with these kids that your grandmother is working with, second graders and fourth graders, and they don't have the words, and so when they describe something, it's very limited, very simple. You add words, you add vocabulary, and she works very hard to give them, increase their vocabulary. Then you can describe things more accurately, I would say, at the minimum. And the other part, going back to art, is that you can bring more to that conversation and fill in more of that communication.
Okay, so we hit processing incomplete information, neuroplasticity. Now let's put a bow on this. So what you've been really like messing with me lately, Blake, and it's right in the middle of the research that you're doing right now, is how effectively our brain will take an image. Let's just do image processing, right? But I know it's more broad than that. And what our brain is, when Dad, when you look at that Coke can or the root beer can or me, you think you're looking at an image of this familiar image that you've seen 1,000 times before, but
1,000,000,000 times.
But what's actually happening, or what looks like we're happening, and what's amazing to me is like what I'm sensing is that this is dark ages. Like we're still yet to discover penicillin, right? In terms of like really understanding what's going on here, but we're starting to get hints that your brain is not processing that whole image. There are front end filters. And Blake, please jump in, because I know I still don't have this perfect. But there's first a set of filters that take that kind of raw image stream, and this is all running in real time at 20 frames a second or 30 frames a second, and it's taking that and it's decomposing it into a bunch of the analogy I've been using is like Lego bricks, right? And there's 20 or 30. There's not, or maybe it's 200, but it's not 200,000. It's not 2 million of these individual bricks, right? And it'll take that and it'll say, okay, well this is this brick with a diagonal line going this way, and it's literally something that simple. And here's another one with a diagonal line going this way, and here's another one with a gradient of horizontal lines, and it literally takes that what you're used to seeing is this thing that looks like a face or a coffee cup, and it breaks it down into just the salient handful of bricks that it needs to then map that and go, that's Michael, that's Blake, that's Sherry, that's Becky, and do it that quick. And that's why it's so quick. That's why like our ability to do image recognition is so quick. So we can take this really complex image space, take out all the noise, grab just a handful of Lego blocks that we know that we need to recognize the image, and then shove that into our image recognizer, and we're only having to process this narrow band of.
I get it.
So yeah, so now take that, correct whatever I said wrong.
No, that was great. Those are actually really, yeah. So there's a.
It's
Hey guys.
our ladies.
What's up?
Hi. Did you guys take the quiche out of the oven?
All right, so
Uh-oh.
Is it burning? Oh no.
did we burn the quiche?
Yeah.
Really?
It's not, it's just brown, but
Okay.
It's just
browner than I would.
So correct. Well, first of all, did I get that right?
Yeah. So there's basically a cascade of processing steps. So I mentioned this huge dimension reduction going from photoreceptors, which is like where the photons just fall onto the onto your photoreceptors, and then and that's actually kind of at the back of the eye, and then they'll just get processed through these what's called the retinal ganglion cells. There's already a filtering step there, but then I think what Mike is referring to is the map basically from the retina responses to the first part of the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex. And there we find basically that cells are like the neurons in the primary visual cortex are responses. They're basically like edge detectors. So they're looking in a certain part of your visual field for an edge oriented at a particular angle. And you could say like, well, why? Why is that a good basis? Right. So basically like every image, right? I'm going to write it as a linear combination, a sum of a lot of indicator variables that tell me is there an edge here like this, or an edge here like this? Is there an edge here like this? And so answering that question, is there an edge like this or like this in each of the places in space, that maps basically an input image to a set of responses of those neurons. The neuron's firing if there is an edge there, and it's not firing if there isn't. Right? So that whole idea is called a neural code. So a code is like a map or a way of representing the details about the stimulus or the natural environment in terms of responses of neurons. And
So is that inherent or is that trained?
That's a great question. So the early stuff we don't think is trained, like the very first filter I mentioned, which is the photoreceptors to retina. That's just sort of seems like it's encoded by your genome. It's probably innate. However, like for instance, we know that genomics data and connectomics data for like flies, like Drosophila, like their retina is like very precise and pretty reproducible organism to organism. So there doesn't seem to be like variability due to learning there. But in the cortex, there is some variability. So for instance, as you grow up, or like you can do these experiments with mice where you like train them to do certain behavioral tasks. So you like show them edges at different angles, and you try to get them really good at recognizing an edge at this angle versus an edge at a slightly different angle. And you basically try to get that discrimination threshold, that angle as small as possible. Okay, when you do that training procedure, you find that the cells that code for this kind of angle become like actually more of the cells become responsive to things at this angle because it's behaviorally relevant, right? The person conducting the experiment will give the mouse sugar water or something if it gets it right. So it needs to learn basically to recognize edges at this angle. So it's going to now allocate a greater budget of neurons.
Pavlovian flies.
Yeah, exactly. So we know, for instance, that even in this early processing step, there is some plasticity. So like some top-down signals are coming back and telling V1 to change its response profile so it can do better on this image discrimination task. What I'm modeling right now, though, is I'm sort of studying a model where you assume that basically the time scale over which you're doing a task is shorter than the time scale required to like change this code. So I'm imagining there's a fixed code. So like, you know, either you learned it through experience or you got it through your genome, but then you want to learn a new behavioral task really rapidly from that fixed code. And that mathematically, it sounds kind of abstract, but it's related to a machine learning model that people study all the time called kernel machines. So we can talk about that.
Sounds like what a Kalman filter is based on.
Common filter, yeah.
Kalman, where you make a change, but you make it slower than the input of it. So, so the other thing that came to my mind when you were describing that was fly-by-wire airplanes. So the pilot moves the joystick, but that doesn't move the ailerons anymore. In a fly-by-wire airplane, that tells the computer, okay, I want to turn
It's a
left
suggestion
here.
about where you want it to
I'd very much like you to control the airplane in a left turn. And the computer then says, okay, let me check this, check that. And that, I don't want to go more than 9 Gs because you'll pass out, but I'll give you 8.5. And then it says, I'll do it. So, you know, that's, and of course it's learned, and that's pure learning that it can do these things, and that's what you're saying. So you got this input that is genetic, and then you got this learned, I can do this and under these circumstances, but not under the other circumstances. So I see an analog to what you're talking about in fly-by-wire aircraft.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of models of exactly, you mentioned Pavlovian conditioning, or like we would call it, I think now, reinforcement learning, because there's actually a lot of different ways.
Give Pavlov the credit he's due.
Well, so that's one way you can do it, but there's other kinds of reward strategies that generate similar learning. But you can model, people do think about these kind of like a control system, and the most successful AI algorithms for game playing are based on reinforcement learning principles. So the AlphaGo, AlphaZero, kind of DeepMind models that beat the world champions at Go or chess. These things are based on deep reinforcement learning. So you basically have a big neural network that its whole job is just to learn how to approximate a reward function, or a predictive reward, or a value, or what's called the Q function, right? So these things are basically saying, look at the state of the game board, right?
How much is this move worth?
And then
How much is this
predict
move
basically for this state of the game board, if I'm the black pieces instead of the white pieces, if I'm the black pieces in this state of the game board, what is my expected probability? What's my probability of winning the game? And you just train an algorithm to just get really good at that. That's what takes so much data and time to train.
But it's kind of brute force.
It's a little brute force, but I mean that's a large combinatorial search space, so it's hard to see how you could kind of get around that.
There's so many options.
And now we know that like what came out of that procedure, just doing brute force reinforcement learning, it generates very kind of creative gameplay, like gameplay that is not biased by whatever's in the human chess textbooks, right? Like,
well, didn't they say like some new novel moves or strategies for Go emerged out of that?
So not the Queen's Gambit, but this is the
AlphaZero Gambit.
The Joker's Gambit.
Yeah, you can go on. So there's this wonderful YouTube channel called Agad Mator, and he just does like chess video analysis and stuff. But he has a lot of videos dedicated to AlphaZero, where he just sort of like watches AlphaZero play against other game engines like Stockfish, which is more like it's a rules engine.
If statements.
If statements, yeah. It's not really AI, but watching the gameplay is like really interesting because you see that there's like new patterns that AlphaZero picked up on just by doing this simulated gameplay for like millions of hours or whatever.
That people haven't traditionally done.
But not just those. So also like Atari, several of these other things. There's this idea that like you just have an input that's like the game state, and you try to map and predict basically expected reward, and then you compare your expectation with what reward you actually got. You see the error, and I mean this should sound familiar now, but you look at the error between like what you predicted and what you got, and then you backpropagate that error, update all the parameters in your model, and then
run it again.
You get better. So that whole process is called gradient descent. So it's just you have like a huge number of knobs, billion knobs or whatever, and you just tweak the knobs until you get like the good performance.
Well, Dad, this
is consistent with one of my thinking of always start with the end in mind.
Yeah.
Well, this is part of the problem. So remember, we kind of started earlier on, and I was working towards making a case that we're a little bit stuck in the AI world.
You
right?
bet.
We've gotten really great at this reinforcement learning and building these massive, when they say deep learning, deep learning machines.
I understand what that means. Lots of data.
Well, it's actually not about the amount of data. It's the amount of layers or nodes. Think neurons, right? How many neurons? These layers of neurons that you're putting into your model, right? Training. But the problem is every node. So every time you create a new layer, so a layer, think of it as a 10 nodes or 100 nodes, right? But then you throw up another layer of 10 nodes or 100 nodes, and every one of these has to connect to each one of those, and it has an individual weight that comes from these training cycles. Put another layer in, and now all of those each one of those has, and so the complexity, the computing requirements start to go
to brute force, if you're going to brute force.
Yeah, but so we learn really quickly, and the reason that we all of a sudden just blasted right through these some of these barriers, like with language recognition and image recognition, was one, we had a lot of good training data all of a sudden because of the broad access to the internet and all these recording all these people on their phones and Alexa and all that all of a sudden. But then also we had enough compute power that we could actually go deep enough in these things, but it feels really brute force compared to like your brain's running at approximately the computing equivalent of about 12 hertz, not kilohertz or megahertz, 12 hertz.
I had a computer like that once.
Right? But we have all of these pre-filters, like on image processing, that are removing all of this noise at 30 frames a second. It's pretty crazy that they're able to do that, removing all this noise and just feeding just those key Lego blocks that you need.
That is exactly the thought that I had when you asked me, and I thought about it later, not Sudoku. You asked me, could Sudoku be programmed? And the answer is yes, but there's probably not enough computer space to put all of the if thens or it's amazingly huge how many options every single step is in Sudoku. But our brains see these steps, recognize them, and then you just write a number in. That's the easy part. But recognizing it is recognizing these patterns that maybe are there, sometimes they're not there. But there's, yes, you could program it, but I don't think you have enough lifetime left to program it.
Yeah, probably. So speaking of that, now let's use that as our enough lifetime left. So, Blake, you're in the middle of a really interesting research group at Harvard now, where y'all are not, you're on kind of a parallel path with what maybe is going on at OpenAI or at Google or. And maybe not. Maybe I'm
in China, where you
well, so
went to
not,
work.
yeah. So I think, academia. Well, especially my lab, we have I think more of a theoretical bent, and also, if you don't have the compute resources of like let's say a Google or an Amazon or a OpenAI or whatever, and you can't drop $1 million to train the biggest language model, I think the focus is now understanding when and why do these things work at all. So sorry, but what were you saying?
No, this is exactly where I want you to go.
Okay.
I think we've laid enough groundwork now for you to kind of unpack the nature of the research that y'all are doing, and then your hunches. And I think it's okay to just say, I think this is where this maybe leads, right? And we don't know for sure. And it could just run into another series of dead ends, but yeah, I think that we've laid enough groundwork that you can kind of frame out, because you're not there just for the fun of it. Like I think y'all think you're on a path, on a journey that will hopefully bear some fruit.
Research is going down alleys to see if they're blind.
Sure, absolutely.
And you hope that there will be some that are not.
And Blake talks about this all the time, why academia is is important, because if there's a profit motive and you've got
Suspense,
shareholders that are
yeah.
asking for that
Time limits.
that quarterly return on investment, and then it will, then how much time are you going to spend actually exploring something that could be a blind alley, but it could also result in
Because you can't
the
know
next
going
grade,
into it.
right? So there you go.
Yeah. So in the 90s, actually, there was early 90s, late 80s. There was this AI winter. Okay, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was initial kind of excitement in the mid 80s. Like backpropagation was invented, and like this idea that okay, there's an algorithm now we can use to do this kind of credit assignment. I was mentioning, you look at the output of your network, you compare it with the actual like statistical ground truth, and then you need a way of basically updating the model so you get good performance. There wasn't a consistent way of doing that, but then this guy, actually it's been rediscovered multiple times. It's basically the chain rule. You can use the chain rule from calculus to figure out like how to do this. People got excited, but then they realized they ran into like problems, just like technical problems actually training these things. They took a lot of computing power that they didn't have, and so the field kind of died out, fizzled out, and people lost interest in deep learning. And I worry that if we don't diversify our portfolio, so to speak, of approaches, we might face a similar winter where we now are basically not limited, because we're not limited by any new technique or anything. We're limited because we're sticking with the same technique and just trying to scale it up and see if we get better and better performance. But I'm worried that, so for instance, if you go from like GPT-2 to GPT-3, or like these most recent language models at OpenAI, you see huge gains in the numbers of parameters from like maybe like 500 million to 1 billion to like now 3 billion or something. So you have 3 billion knobs that you're free to turn. Okay, and maybe you have like much small, like a few million observations of text or something, let's say. Classical statistics tells you that's a horrible idea, right? Classical statistics, I don't know if you've taken like, you guys have obviously taken like statistics. If you try fitting a model with many more parameters than observations, like people say, okay, you're prone to overfitting, right? Like this is not going to work well. And so it's actually a puzzle. People don't know why you're able to train these large models and get good performance on held out data. So data from the same distribution that you did not train on. So you didn't just memorize or overfit to these examples, but you actually got good performance on the real task. So from a statistics perspective, this is puzzling, and people don't know why it's true. Like, why is it that if I have many billion parameters in my model, I don't overfit? And there's what's kind of fun, or what's interesting, is we've been working on that question, and actually in a certain limit, when you make the network so overparameterized, so many more parameters than models. Actually, you take the number of parameters to infinity even, you get a consistent sort of solution, and you can write down on a piece of paper, actually, like analytically, what happens when you take this infinite width limit. It's kind of, because once you get to that limit, it's basically like you can start invoking ideas from like statistical mechanics, which is the field of study that concerns itself with large numbers of interacting particles. And, I don't know if this is getting too technical.
No, keep going.
But
your goal is to kind of get us to a point where we can see the potential for what you're working on.
Well, yeah. So I think the big thing is we've developed basically a theory where you take this thermodynamic limit or whatever, you take the number of parameters to infinity, but you keep the data set finite, and you can show there that you get actually good generalization performance even in that limit. So this kind of shows that our conventional ideas about overfitting, our conventional ideas about statistics, when you go to this setting of deep learning, like you may have to rethink them a bit. There's experiments showing that you can randomize labels, randomize like the labels in a data set, and deep learning models are able to still fit that fake data set. So these models are incredibly powerful. There's not a lot of regularization. That could prevent overfitting, but when you train them on the real data set, they somehow work well, and that's a puzzle, and we're trying to solve that puzzle basically. Does that make any sense?
Yes. So I had a thought, a correlation with the way evolution works. So nature tries everything, and only a very small subset of trying everything actually succeed in any given environment at any given time. And so you were describing how they've gone from one level to a higher level of the same thing, but they're not, you're not trying lots of different approaches or whatever. Mutations is what nature would have, and sometimes the mutation helps in a situation, and all the rest of them don't really help, and they die out, or they don't make a contribution. So I was thinking about evolution when you were talking about not sticking to a singular path, but trying, researchers looking at other ways of approaching it. And multiple groups are looking differently, and I think that's the best chance. If everybody's trying to do the same thing, and it's just a matter of who can get there first, who can make the coronavirus first. I mean, that's.
It is interesting, like something you said, I've been thinking about is, there are interviews out there with like Elon Musk talking about the dangers of general AI, and that once or Ray Kurzweil or whatever, and when we hit the singularity, we'll have a Terminator-like, event, and it'll be apocalypse or whatever, It's great stuff for Hollywood, but with one thing that's interesting, like you said it today, is like I almost sense that you have what's driving you almost a little bit more is that you have a bigger fear of us stalling out to the point where we have another AI winter, and we back off on our push of research because we're not making progress. And do you think I'm characterizing that?
Well, that's his job. We ought to be worried about that.
Yeah, so this could be self-preservation instinct, but I think that no, it is a real wonder and a concern. I think that there's a risk when people get really excited about a particular technique and it starts working, and they start just thinking, okay, now I've literally heard podcast interviews with some of the researchers at like OpenAI, and they think that it's a matter really of now just scaling up, more compute, throw more money at it, and then we'll solve it. We'll be done with language forever.
It feels so crude.
And partly it reminds me of these like people that used to work on long range communication, analog signal communications over wires, like telegraph officers, and they're like, oh, we'll just pump bigger and bigger signals into the thing, and which kind of reduce a little bit of the attenuation. But then with the advent of let's just use a digital code with like with redundancy. Let's use redundancy coding so you can like recover with high probability. And
with check bits.
Yeah, doing noisy source coding kind of stuff. And that actually is like a much more elegant and energy efficient solution. And I think we need to be looking for things like that instead of just saying let's scale up. Let's have a bigger model. Let's have more data. Let's have more compute time.
My sense is that
elegance is always better.
My sense is that your lab starts more often at the whiteboard, and with a piece of chalk in your hand instead of a keyboard in your hand. Do you think that that's accurate?
Yeah. So we're all kind of lapsed physicists, I think, and I think that though we've been interested in neuroscience and in artificial intelligence and like using ideas from either to say something about the other, so we're hoping this is some kind of virtuous cycle. There's a lot of other groups too that do that, like the MIT Brain and Cognitive Science group is also a lot like that too. But I think that what makes us really unique, I think even in comparison to some of these other groups that do a lot of computational neuro and AI research, is that we do try to get closed form analytic solutions to some solvable models. That can limit the scope sometimes of what you're able to do on a piece of paper, but sometimes actually you can capture most of the interesting things about a system by making those slight simplifying modifications. Einstein once said, make a model as simple as possible but no simpler. And it's still an argument about where that line is in understanding deep learning.
Hold on. I've never heard this one. Make a model as simple as possible but no simpler.
Right.
Because you're leaving something out if you make it simpler.
Yeah.
And you got waste. You got your baggage, excess baggage if it's
I love that.
Not simple enough.
Yeah, so I think we strive for that. Like, what are an appropriate set of simplifying assumptions so we can understand how deep learning works? And so, for instance, on this last few papers that we've been working on, me and Abdul and Jengis, we've been working on basically simplifying this up. So we're letting there be nonlinearity in the neural network. A lot of people study like linear neurons, which, at the end of the day, that's not going to be as expressive. You're only going to be able to learn a linear function. So that's not, but we basically study this limit where when you take the number of neurons in every layer to go to arbitrarily large, actually to infinity, right? In that limit, you can use central limit theorem at every layer and say, okay, so all the inputs into these neurons, it's a sum of infinitely many random variables. So those things should concentrate, right? The distribution of those inputs should concentrate like in a central limit theorem kind of result. And then you can just do that. You can calculate second moments at every layer. And this is called the neural tangent kernel, basically, or the neural network Gaussian process idea. And working in that limit, we derive basically predictions about how well the network performs on a certain learning task as a function of the amount of training data you had. So even in the infinite width limit, you can say, imagine I get more and more data, how does my error on the test set go down? And there's some techniques from physics called the replica method, or like called the physics of disordered systems approach, and we utilize some of those tools to like figure that out. And that's all whiteboard stuff. So you can do a lot of that before you even enter any keystrokes.
Whether we know it or not, we're all physicists of different capacities.
A physicist is just someone interested in modeling and understanding the world. So
exactly.
Well, okay, so I'm gonna put you on the spot then. Right now, well, actually, let me start here. 2 years ago, if you had to rank order where you of these 4 domains, what was your rank order? Mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, or neuroscientist? Which one? How would you rank order those?
By what measure?
But like where he felt like he had the strongest knowledge, where you were spending most of your energy, time thinking,
making the biggest contribution to the advancement
just
of
him
AI?
personally. No, just Blake personally.
Oh, what has Blake studied?
Blake, where are you? Where were you 2 years ago? Graduating from WashU 2 years ago.
You were doing a lot of neuro 2 years ago. I remember those were the conversations.
During undergrad I oscillated a little bit. So I started off, I think after my sophomore year, I was like super excited by like computational neuroscience, and like I did a little research project on like spiking network models or something. And then I actually kind of caught the physics bug, and I took like there was an old very very old, like an old guard theoretical like quantum field theorist in our department.
Awesome.
Carl Bender, and he's known for he's super famous, and he does all this cool stuff with like PST symmetry. And he taught a 2-semester course on mathematical methods of theoretical physics, and I took that, and I was like, oh my god, this is like amazing, and I love this. And I think that was an incredibly formative experience. I still use all those tools all the time, what I've learned there. And some of the most beautiful mathematics I've encountered was in that course. But then I was thinking about going
Was
to
that at Harvard or
Washington?
Washington?
That was my junior year. And then so I was thinking a little bit for like a time, maybe 6 months or so, I was thinking about like going to physics grad school. But then I started reading more about I encountered more AI papers and more papers about like what's going on in deep learning, what's going on in computational neuroscience models and stuff. And so I made a kind of transition that, I guess, summer before my senior year, where I decided that like I wanted to work as much as I can at kind of the intersection of those 4 things, right? And I think I've lucked out, because in my lab, like some days you're just like hacking away, like trying to write some algorithm that does something, some like on the key, and you're just sitting at a terminal. The other days, you're at the whiteboard. The other days you're like, learning with the brain, like different imaging techniques and all this stuff. So I get to do a lot of different things, which is like I'm very blessed to have that opportunity, because I think I am do have a lot of general interests.
So do you think like then,
or a very specific interest across a broad spectrum of issues of items?
So you think maybe like right now when you feel one of those is falling behind, that you'll kind of refocus your areas in that area, and you're really just trying to raise the water level in all 4 of those domains simultaneously? Yeah.
So I'd say everyone in the lab probably is a convex combination of those 4 things, right? So you have these 4 points. You're in the convex hull of this, of this thing. But where you are, depends on like what proportion of time you spend in each of these different areas. I'd say I'm a little bit more. There are some people that, for instance, have a background in like experimental neuroscience, and so they're mainly interested in like working out models to predict basically what would happen in certain neural experiments. The paper I'm working on right now actually is looking at some recordings from this V1, the primary visual cortex. So I'm actually using neuroscience data, but I have this sort of theory that's based on like machine learning kind of principles. So it's a mix, but I'd say I'm probably more on the machine learning side within the lab. But yeah, I don't know.
That's awesome.
But
so so there's no way to know, but if you had to guess, 20 or 30 years from now, when you're kind of looking back on it's hopefully a very, very productive and fruitful career, do you think you're going to have maintained that balance, or do you sense that you're going to probably wind up
something's going to win out?
Do you think something's going to become your primary focus at some point in the future?
Yeah, so I think if you, instead of framing it as different departments or different areas of research, if you just frame a goal and just ask what is the goal, what am I trying to understand, if you're just like what I really want to know is I want to develop a science of intelligence, right? I want to work on the science of intelligence, and that could be in you can learn things about biological organisms, like by studying their brains and that sort of thing. You can also just try to really build it. That's a good test to see if you have a good understanding of what intelligent processing and intelligent information processing looks like. So that AI is the ultimate proof of concept that you've figured out a theory of intelligence. But there's also, you need tools from computer science. You need tools from physics. You need tools from mathematics. So I see really like just that goal, figuring out like how to create an energy efficient, data efficient, general intelligent agent, like period, like full stop. How do you do that? I think that there's a lot of different directions you could go to try to answer that question.
So you have a singular goal with lots of
methods, approaches.
Components that can contribute to attaining that goal. That goal may change in 20 years because something may just pop up and completely skew everything else. But we don't know that at this point.
We don't know that, And there are good and interesting questions, even just within machine learning, that are not specifically related to those things. So like, for instance, just like practical things like I want to protect the privacy of my users' data, but I still want to be able to train a machine learning model that gives me accurate predictions at the same time without, while keeping things anonymized. So like this whole field of differential privacy I think is super exciting, but it's not really related to the current thing I'm interested in, right? So maybe I
that has a commercial value versus
but there are hard math problems related to it that are.
Well, guys, this has been a friggin' awesome hour, and I really, really, really appreciate y'all taking some time on here. I want to say one thing. I know I've kind of said this to you before, but like we hear this all the time when you're out just in social circles and somebody's like, they are cloning sheep now. Hey, they are working on figuring out how to go to Mars. Hey, they now have a better way to predict weather, right? And you're always like, who is the they? And I got to tell you, like this year, being here with like you and Camilla and stuff, and I've actually gotten to it's not just catching up at Christmas or whatever. Like every day, you and I are talking about this stuff, and I get to kind of see what they is, because this is the tip of the spear, right? This is what humans are doing right now, and it's kind of cool to have a sense of what is the kind of the our current asymptote of knowledge in humanity around this domain, and I don't understand all of it, but I get a lot of osmotic seeping my way, and I get a real
feel like that,
and I get a real sense of what's going on in this space. And of course I'm watching the all the YouTube videos, and I love Lex Friedman. I think he's phenomenal and all that, but to actually get to witness this every day is probably one of the biggest blessings in my whole life. And I'm so. And what I love most about how you're approaching this whole thing, Blake, is that you're not married to a direction here, and it really came out in this discussion, right? You're on the journey, it's the journey is what's so important to you, and staying immersed in just I love what you said a minute ago, is just this pursuit of understanding intelligence, and just keeping it that in general, and letting the research take you where it's going to take you. And you've I've pushed on you a lot in the past, like, you should be out there, you could make so much money right now, and you're just not, you're not prioritizing that. You're prioritizing the pursuit of unabashed research for the sake of gaining new and novel knowledge. And
I love it.
It warms my heart to know, I just happen to have that guy in my family, much less living in my house right now. But it just warms my heart to know that there are people like that on the planet, and I just love and respect you for it. I just wanted to say that.
Oh, thanks, man. Well, I'm incredibly privileged, and I think like you guys have been remarkably supportive, and like you've given me a huge number of opportunities that I think most people don't get, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of that. And it is a privilege to actually get to work on this stuff and to not have to worry about making ends meet and all that sort of thing.
Where your next bowl of yogurt's gonna come from.
Yeah.
But your efforts have earned you this path. You didn't come to this path without a lot of hard work, and your dad has paved the path, but you have walked that path, and you have done the hard work, and it's a huge compliment to both of you that this is happening. So Elon Musk is building a rocket ship to go to Mars. That's not making money on Mars. That's not,
No, he's in the same kind of pursuit.
It's, let's make a rocket ship to Mars. You're making a rocket ship to intelligence.
Well, and yeah, I think as Michael, you were very interested in always pointing out, like, you should always go back to first principles. And I think just having that overall goal in mind, asking why aren't we there, like what do I think are the current problems, just like, keep that mantra in your head, right? And then you can go in different directions, but like try to always be optimizing for that one.
You're always going to tack back to that direction.
So yeah, I think that's sort of my, at least right now, if you had to ask me, that's sort of what I want to dedicate my career to, is just like working more on these sorts of questions.
And I want to say one last thing about you, and I think that you feel this, is you changed a cultural thing in our family. The most important thing that you did, and I think that this was actually a rejection of what your father didn't do for you.
Yes.
Is
filling in a big gap.
Nobody is a perfect parent, but actually I believe that if you just do this one thing well, you're going to get phenomenal results. And what you did for me is never, without exception, without fail, you never ever slipped up on always just encouraging me, supporting me, and just loving me. And that's it. And I always felt it the whole way through. And I wanted that for my boys. And you modeled that without having somebody else model for you. You broke the chain in our family.
I did.
It's the biggest gift and blessing that you've ever given me. And then
Hardest thing I've ever done.
By proxy, that gift has gotten passed on to these boys.
Well, and also directly, I mean, I think a significant like a significant causal factor that helped me, I think, develop an early interest in science was just sitting around and watching all those Nova specials and all those history of quantum mechanics and
sorry about that,
Einstein and gravitational waves sort of stuff with you. And like I think that was a very formative set of talks. And I remember I must have been like 4 or 5, but just your demonstration of how tectonic plates works by smashing 2 forks together and watching the forks go. I thought that was a lot of fun, and I think that you're to a large part one of the big reasons why I got interested in science in the first place. So,
well, you always welcomed the information, so it made it easy.
Awesome, guys. Well, that's a great note to close on. I love both of y'all with all of my heart, and just thank you for spending this hour with me.
This is a great idea, Michael. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Awesome.